Well, I'm going to start this morning with a test. How's that sound? Like a good teacher, right? What are some of the stories that you learned about in Sunday school so far? Anyone? A story that you learned about in Sunday school last year or the year before. What are some of the stories you've gone over? Princess and the Pea? No, that wasn't one of them, I'm sure. Drawing blanks? Is that a...
I can't remember what his name is, but the Technicolor coat one.
Joseph, right? Story of Joseph and his brothers, exactly. Any others? It's been a long summer, hasn't it? There's so many. Noah's Ark, there we go. Remember Moses? All right, well, we'll move on to a new question then. Okay, so we have to put failure there. Okay, so, yes.
The mustard seed one?
All right, the mustard seed, exactly. Why do you think these stories are important? Why do we talk about them?
They have life lessons.
They have life lessons, exactly. Did you know, in fact, the stories that you are learning are also stories that we will talk about in church? So, for example, you mentioned Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, to use the long one. Coral's going to be talking about that story today with the adults. See, these stories are something that we can carry with us throughout our entire lives. And you're going to be learning some wonderful stories this year. Does anyone know what the first story is going to be? Oh, come on, let's get someone else. I know you know, Ninja.
David and Goliath?
The story of David and Goliath, right. So that's going to be a wonderful story. You're going to hear about how we can overcome even the biggest obstacles in our lives.
Good morning. The scripture reading today is Genesis 50, 15 to 21, and Matthew 18, 21 to 35. Genesis 50, verses 15 to 21, fearing retribution, Joseph's brothers seek forgiveness. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Matthew 18, 21 to 35, Jesus' teachings on forgiveness. Then Peter came and said to him, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payments to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. May God bless these readings to our understanding.
Thank you, Joanne. Well, welcome back. It is good to see people. You've heard the expression, to err is human and to forgive is divine. Is there anybody here who can say they have never made a mistake? It is so easy, isn't it? And I think, apologies have become almost a weekly occurrence on public television, no less. Whether it's, former President Bill Clinton, Tiger Woods, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and of course, global countries apologizing for things that they've done, including our own United Church of Canada apologizing for our treatment of First Nations people here in our country. To err is human. And yet it can become so hard to forgive people or even to admit when we've done something wrong. I know I'm dating myself, but do you remember the TV show Happy Days with the Fonz, the cool Fonz? And he had one challenge that he could not do, and that was to apologize. He'd say, and he'd just give up. He just couldn't admit it, that he had done anything wrong. And I think we sometimes have trouble admitting it because it doesn't jive with who we know ourselves to be and want to be, that it's not a reflection of our sense of goodness as a person. And so it's hard to admit that it's almost incongruent. And it's hard to know sometimes when people apologize whether they're really sorry for what they did or whether they're just sorry that they got caught. Isn't that true? And so sometimes it's hard to forgive someone, if they keep doing it or you feel like they're not really sorry. That if they could have kept on doing it, they would have. When there's no sense of apology at all. How do you forgive? And sometimes we even make mistakes unwittingly. We don't even know that we've hurt someone by something we've said. Maybe to someone else, and it became gossip that got around and back to them. I know I bought at the UCW Spring Fling book sale. I bought some books. I thought, these look really good. Then 2 of them I realized were our church library books that someone unwittingly didn't realize were even church library books. And so I bought them and I had to return them to the church library. How many of you, there's a lot of us that are committing that crime because there's a lot of books missing from our church library. It's one of those things we forget about. And I know I have books from libraries that don't exist anymore, and I still feel guilty about having them, and I don't even have a chance to return them. And yet when it's serious, when it's something minor, and people it's something small, they bump you, at home, we take something out of the fridge and it seems like someone else sees an empty space and they put something there and you go to put yours back and there's no space anymore. Those little things are easy to forgive, no problem. But when it really hurts you, it's so much harder. And we want to look at, what enables us to forgive and what is forgiveness all about. Certainly the stories that we've heard today, beginning with Matthew's, it was Peter asking a question that prompted the parable. And in his day, the law said if someone does something once, you forgive them. If they do the same thing a second time, you still forgive them. If they make the same mistake 3 times, you still forgive them. If they do it 4 times, you let them have it because they need to learn another way. They're not getting it. And so Peter was saying, if you will, okay, our law says you can forgive 3 times. I'm going to double that. I know that Jesus is generous. I'm going to double that and add an extra one. And so when he said, how many times should we forgive? 7 times? He was expecting to be the golden boy among the disciples who was going to be praised for being so magnanimous in his gesture. And Jesus said, no, 70 times 7. In other words, infinitely, unlimited. How on earth do we do that with someone who continues to offend? And maybe that's the hardest part of forgiveness, is we actually fear the person may do it again. And so we want to remember, if you will, because we want to protect ourselves. We want to remember that this person isn't always safe to be with, that they might hurt us. And so there's a little bit of fear and defensiveness. Sometimes, it's hard to forgive just because we think it's unfair and somehow that they need to be punished for this. They need to recognize that wrong, and until they apologize, there's a wrong that needs to be righted. And so we will not forgive. So when we're asked to forgive, what is it about? I want to share some other parts of that parable with you, because he talked about a king who was calling his servants into account. And one of his servants owed him 10,000 talents. 1 talent was worth 6,000 denarii, and 1 denarii was a typical day's work. So 10,000 talents was the equivalent of 164,000 years of work, 7 days a week. In other words, even if you believed in reincarnation, you could not come back enough times to pay off that debt ever. And he pleaded for mercy and asked to be forgiven and said he would pay it back, as ridiculous as that was. And the king forgave him. And at that point, it was the king who was being honored for the kind of person he was. And then that same servant who was forgiven turned around to one of his fellow servants, a colleague, if you will, and said, pay up. You owe me 100 denarii. And the servant says the same thing that this one had said to the king. Please have mercy on me. Just give me a little more time, I'll pay it back. And in all likelihood, he probably would have. At least some of it. By Roman law at the time, people were thrown in jail when they owed a debt for two reasons. One is either they were checking to see if they might have a secret stash of money that, now they'll pay the ransom, if you will, in order to get out. They could have paid it. And the second reason is that maybe the family members, it's sort of like taking them hostage. Maybe the family members will be responsible and honorable and pay the debt on behalf of this one. And if none of that happens, then the wife and the children will be sold into slavery so that at least the person could get some work in exchange for it. So throwing them in jail was the normal practice. But when the king found out what this servant did to the other, they would have been made a laughing stock. So instead of the servant modeling after the master, they were made to experience the punishment for their own debt that they were handing out. And isn't that the way it works symbolically? That we are putting up walls between ourselves and people that have wronged us if we don't forgive them. When we're with them at family gatherings or we see them somewhere, it's like the elephant in the room that makes us uncomfortable. It does build walls when there's an unforgiven wrong. We all know that it's the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and we've been hearing about it in the news, I think, all week. And I want you to think about what it is that you remember about that event. There was such an opportunity for people in the United States and the world to look at why do they hate us so much? And what could we have done differently to reconcile this, to make the world safer? But there wasn't any sense of wrongdoing. There was a sense only that the terrorists were the evil ones that needed to be punished, and the war on terrorism and greater fear began. That's what happens, isn't it? The cycle of violence escalates. Do you know that since 9/11, where almost 3,000 people tragically died in a truly horrific event, and you have to feel for the families. But since then, 6,000 U.S. and Canadian military have died fighting the war on terror. Double the number. They've spent Canada $92 billion on security since 9/11. Is that the best use of our resources? Some for sure. I know our world has changed. But I want to tell you some other stories about people who reacted differently in the face of that event. One of them was a woman by the name of Phyllis Rodriguez, and her son Greg died in one of those Twin Tower crashes. But about a month after that, as she was watching the news and reading the papers, she kept seeing this image of Aisha Moussaoui, who was the mother of Zacharias Moussaoui, who was arrested and accused of being one of the terrorist bombers. And she kept thinking about what this mother must be going through and the suffering she must be feeling. And she thought, there's no real difference. Suffering is suffering. And she was hurting from the pain of the death of her son, and this mother was hurting over the tragedy happening to her son. There are, believe it or not, 9/11 groups for families of the terrorist attack to get together to seek freedom and reconciliation. They're called 9/11 Reconciliation of Families of Terrorism. Didn't even know that existed, I bet. And this mother of the son accused asked to have a meeting with any of the families who were victims of the attack. They didn't know why she wanted to meet with them, and the mother didn't know what kind of a response she was going to get from those who might come. And a total of 8 families came to meet with this mother. And when they first met, on a very secret, private place, because there was so much supremacy almost of United States and anti-Islamic movement, that this Islamic mother had to meet with the American citizens in a secure, private spot, a safe place. And when they met, they didn't even say a word. They just hugged and embraced and wept for the pain that each one of them was feeling. And then this Islamic mother, Aisha Masawi, said, "I don't know if my son is innocent or guilty, but I feel so sorry about what has happened to your families and all who were affected. And this is not what Islam stands for. This is not what our religion teaches. I do not condone this act." And then she began to talk about the story of her life and the hardships she had gone through and the loss of 2 young children. And then that opened up each of the families sharing their stories. And after 2.5 hours, they felt like they were friends, longtime friends, went out to lunch together and socialize. And that woman Phyllis Rodriguez, who lost her son Greg, said that this was the second most important day in her life, about a year later, because it was the generosity of this Islamic mother that spawned a generosity in them. And isn't that the effect that generosity has? It truly changes us and brings out the best in us. Another church minister, Tom Schumann, has said, we need to remember 9/11. We need to empathize with those families that are hurting. But we also need to remember September 12th, when thousands of people from around the globe made a trip specially to come and help and support. When people donated like you could not believe, when churches were opened in prayer and as feeding stations, when Russia, we often don't know it, but when Russia created a sculpture that is on the peninsula of New Jersey in the harbor there. It's a 100-foot tall bronze sculpture with a 40-ton teardrop hanging in the middle of the tower as an act of being in solidarity with the United States against terrorism in the world. And that didn't make much news in the press. But when you're traveling by water, you actually see that first. And it's in perfect alignment with the Statue of Liberty given by France and where the World Trade Center stood. A symbol of world solidarity, because 24 Canadians died. And do you know what? Someone from 90 different countries around the world were part of those almost 3,000 that died. It was a world event that sparked an outpouring of solidarity. Forgiveness is really about choosing who we want to be. It has nothing to do with the offense and the offender and what they do or do again. That is what they are about, and it's a reflection of them. Forgiveness is about who we choose to be. And whether we want to worship a God who says, through Jesus on the cross, forgive them, they know not what they do. To the very people who are not apologizing, but who are even chanting for his death, I forgive you. God, forgive them. It is an invitation then to live up to that part of our being that is capable of choosing a higher way.